All right, so Germany between 1918 and 1945, huge changes, right? We're talking about World War I ending, the Weimar Republic, and then, of course, Hitler and World War II. We've got school lesson plans here, historical overviews, even some stuff from a journalist who was actually in Germany in the 1930s. Should be a good one.
Yeah, it really is a fascinating period. You see a whole country trying to rebuild
Yeah.
after a brutal war, and they have to figure out a new political system at the same time. It's like a recipe for instability.
Yeah, no kidding. So it's 1918. Germany's in chaos. The Kaiser takes off. They lost the war. And all of a sudden, they're a republic. Talk about a wild ride.
Absolutely. And not everybody's happy about this new republic. I mean, imagine it. They had a monarchy for centuries,
Right.
and then poof, it's
Right.
gone. And they've got this brand new democracy. So you've got the elites who want the old system back.
Sure.
And then you've got these extremist groups on both sides, the communists on the left and the fascists on the right, and they want to just blow the whole thing up.
So in the middle of all of this, you've got the Social Democratic Party, the SPD. They're trying to make this parliamentary democracy work. What were some of the biggest problems they had to deal with?
Well, one of the first things they had to deal with was a threat from the far left. Just a few months after the war ended in January 1919, we see the Spartacus Uprising, this communist revolution led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht.
So why communism? Why did that appeal to some Germans at that time?
Well, Germany was really struggling after the war. Lots of poverty. People couldn't find work. There was this feeling that the old ways had failed.
Right.
So communism, with its promise of equality and workers having more power, it offered a completely different way of doing things.
A radical alternative.
Exactly. It appealed to the people who felt like capitalism had let them down.
Well,
People who wanted a fairer system.
so the Spartacus Uprising shows just how unstable Germany was back then. But it failed in the end. What does that tell us about how strong the Weimar Republic was in those early years?
Well, the fact that the uprising failed shows that the Republic, as shaky as it was, still had support from important institutions, like the military,
Right.
but it also shows how divided German society was and how dangerous those extremist ideas still were. The Republic was walking a very fine line.
And on top of all those internal struggles, Germany also had to deal with the Treaty of Versailles. Talk about kicking somebody while they're down. This treaty blamed Germany for World War I, and it led to resentment and economic problems. That would have a huge impact on the country for years to come. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the Treaty of Versailles was a major turning point. Germany had to accept that they were responsible for the war, and they got hit with these huge reparation payments. They
Yeah.
lost territory, and they weren't allowed to have a big army. All of this created a deep feeling of resentment and humiliation.
Yep.
It made people angry and nationalistic, and it really undermined their faith in the new republic.
And in this atmosphere of resentment, we see the rise of this stab-in-the-back myth. The idea that Germany didn't actually lose the war, but that they were betrayed by their own government. How did that myth spread so widely, and what kind of impact did it have on how people saw the Republic?
It was powerful propaganda. It played on people's fears and frustrations.
Yeah.
It gave them someone to blame. It let them shift the blame away from the military and put it on the shoulders of this new government. They said the government was weak and incompetent.
Okay.
And the right-wing groups, including the Nazis, they really latched onto this myth. They used it to make the Republic look even worse and gain support for themselves.
So you've got the Treaty of Versailles causing all this resentment, and the stab-in-the-back myth making things even worse. And then on top of all of that, the German economy completely falls apart.
Exactly. The economic crisis in the early 1920s was a direct result of that treaty. Germany was really struggling to pay those reparations,
I bet.
and it led to France occupying the Ruhr region in 1923.
I know, it was a big deal.
It was a huge blow. The Ruhr was Germany's industrial heartland.
Right. And what did the government do? They printed more money, which led to hyperinflation. That wasn't just a little economic blip. It totally messed up everyday life for regular people.
Yeah, you're telling me. Imagine your life savings suddenly becoming worthless. People needed wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy bread.
Wow.
This economic chaos just eroded what little trust people had left in the Weimar Republic. They were desperate for solutions, and that made them vulnerable to those extremist ideas.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Huh.
So we've got post-war Germany with all this chaos, political turmoil, a terrible economy. This all sets the stage for something bad. Where do we go from here?
Okay, so we've seen that the Weimar Republic is in deep trouble. But then in the mid-1920s, things seem to calm down a little. For a bit, at least. Did things actually get better, or was that just like a break before things got even worse?
Well, in 1924, the U.S. came in with this plan, the Dawes Plan. It was supposed to help Germany get back on its feet
All right.
and ease up on those crazy reparation payments.
They restructured the payments, gave Germany some loans, and tried to stabilize the currency.
So for a few years there, it looks like Germany might actually pull through. The economy is recovering. People are feeling a little more hopeful. But I'm guessing that didn't last.
Yeah, you're right to be skeptical. The Dawes Plan helped in the short term, but it didn't fix the underlying problems, like the structural issues in the German economy and the fact that people still hated the Treaty of Versailles.
Yeah.
Plus, it depended a lot on American investment.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right.
And then boom, the Wall Street crash of 1929, the Great Depression, and Germany gets hit hard.
Exactly. The Dawes Plan falls apart, unemployment goes through the roof,
Yeah.
and the Weimar Republic is barely hanging on.
And that's where Hitler comes in.
That's right.
He was so good at propaganda.
He was a master at it,
He exploited all that misery and offered these simple solutions.
which were also really dangerous.
Totally. He played on people's fears and prejudices,
Right.
blaming Jews, communists, and the Treaty of Versailles for all of Germany's problems.
And people bought it,
It's scary how easily people can be swayed by someone like that.
especially during a crisis.
For sure.
Hitler gave people a scapegoat,
Right.
someone to blame, and he promised to make Germany strong and proud again.
A return to greatness.
Exactly. And his message worked. By 1932, the Nazi Party was the biggest party in the Reichstag.
Wow. So they had a ton of influence. Let's talk about how Hitler actually came to power. There are a few key moments that stand out, like the beer hall putsch in 1923. What was he trying to do there? And how did it help him, even though it failed?
The beer hall putsch was this crazy attempt to take over Bavaria.
Wow.
It was a total disaster.
Okay.
And Hitler ended up in prison,
Yeah.
but his trial gave him a national stage,
Mhm.
so more people heard his ideas. And while he was in prison, he wrote Mein Kampf,
Oh, wow.
which laid out his whole twisted ideology.
So prison was like a publicity boost for him.
In a way, yeah.
And then in 1933, there's the Reichstag fire. How did that help the Nazis gain more power?
The Reichstag fire was a turning point. The Nazis used it as an excuse to crack down on everyone.
Oh, wow.
They suspended civil liberties, arrested their political opponents. It was basically the end of any real opposition.
And that paved the way for Hitler's dictatorship.
Exactly.
And just a few weeks later, on January 30, 1933, Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany, the Weimar Republic is dead, and the Nazi regime begins. How did they manage to dismantle a democracy so quickly?
Well, they were really good at propaganda and intimidation.
Right.
They took control of the media.
Sure.
They shut down anyone who disagreed with them, and they created this atmosphere of fear.
Wow.
They appealed to people's patriotism and their desire for order.
Right.
But at the same time, they demonized their opponents, and they blamed minorities for everything.
Like the Jews.
Yes.
And one of the most horrifying things the Nazis did
Yeah.
was the systematic persecution of Jews, which culminated in Kristallnacht in 1938. That wasn't just some random act of violence, that was a planned attack on Jewish businesses and synagogues all across Germany.
Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, was a terrifying turning point.
Yeah.
It showed that the Nazis were willing to use violence on a massive scale,
Right.
and it was a preview of the horrors that were to come.
The Holocaust.
Exactly.
So while all of this is happening inside Germany, Hitler's also got his sights set on expanding German territory and dominating Europe. He remilitarizes the Rhineland, annexes Austria, and demands the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. What did the other European powers do about this? Did they try to stop him?
At first, Britain and France tried to appease Hitler.
Appease him?
Yeah. They thought they could avoid another war by giving him what he wanted.
Oh, wow.
They figured if they gave him enough, he'd eventually be satisfied.
And that didn't work out so
They backfired.
big time.
It just made Hitler bolder.
And then September 1st, 1939, Hitler invades Poland.
And that was it.
It was the start of World War II
It was.
and a turning point. Not just for Germany, but for the whole world.
It was the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in human history.
So we've seen Germany go from a defeated nation to an economic disaster,
Yeah.
to a breeding ground for this hateful ideology. And now they're starting another world war. What happens next? We left off with Hitler invading Poland. That's the start of World War II.
Yeah.
What happens next? How does the war actually go for Germany?
Well, in the first couple of years of the war, Hitler used this strategy called Blitzkrieg. It was all about speed and overwhelming force. They
Hmm.
used tanks and planes and fast-moving infantry, and they were able to conquer a lot of Europe really quickly.
Yeah, it's amazing how quickly they took over all those countries. Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, even France fell in just a few weeks.
Yeah.
Hitler and the Nazis must have felt invincible. Did that early success maybe contribute to their downfall? Like, did they get overconfident?
Maybe. It's possible that all those victories made them arrogant. Maybe they started believing their own propaganda about
Yeah.
how the Aryan race was superior and how the German army couldn't be defeated.
Right.
That could have led to some bad decisions later on.
Like invading the Soviet Union in 1941.
Yeah, that was a big one.
Why did Hitler break his agreement with Stalin and launch Operation Barbarossa?
Hitler had always wanted to conquer the Soviet Union.
Really?
Yeah, he saw it as living space for the German people,
Okay.
and he thought that all the resources there would make Germany even more powerful.
So he was going for total domination.
Yeah, pretty much. But he made a big mistake. He underestimated the Soviets.
Oh, so.
He didn't think the Soviet people would fight back so hard, and he didn't realize how strong the Red Army really was.
And fighting on the Eastern Front was brutal.
It was a nightmare. It was a war of attrition.
What does that mean?
It means they were just trying to wear each other down. Both sides lost tons of men and resources.
Wow.
And the Eastern Front was huge. The Soviet Union is massive.
Right.
And the winters there are super harsh. It was a logistical nightmare for the Germans.
So the Eastern Front really took its toll on them.
It was a major turning point, the beginning of the end for Germany.
And then in December 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and the U.S. enters the war.
That changed everything.
How so?
Well, the U.S. had a ton of industrial power and resources.
Right.
So now Germany was fighting a two-front war against the Soviets in the east and the Americans and British in the west.
They were stretched way too thin.
Exactly.
So the Allies start to gain the upper hand. And then in June of 1944, we have the D-Day landings in Normandy.
D-Day was a huge turning point.
For sure.
The Allies finally had a foothold in Western Europe, and from there, it was just a matter of time.
Until Germany was defeated.
Right.
And the war goes on, the full horror of the Holocaust becomes clear. The Nazis systematically murdered 6 million Jews
Yeah.
and millions of other people they considered undesirable.
It's a truly horrific chapter in human history.
It's hard to even comprehend the scale of it.
It's a stark reminder of what can happen when hatred and intolerance are allowed to flourish.
And when people turn a blind eye to what's happening around them.
That's-
So the war in Europe finally ends in May 1945. Germany surrenders unconditionally. The country is in ruins.
Both physically and morally.
Yeah. What happens to Germany after the war?
Well, the Allied powers occupied Germany, and they had to figure out how to rebuild the country and deal with the legacy of the Nazi regime.
It must have been incredibly difficult.
It was. Germany was divided, the economy was shattered, and there were all these psychological scars from the war and the Holocaust. But the German people are resilient. They started rebuilding their country and trying to come to terms with their past.
It's an incredible story of resilience and transformation. So we've seen Germany go through so much in just a few decades, from defeat in World War I to the turmoil of the Weimar Republic, to the rise of Hitler and the horrors of World War II. It's a reminder of how fragile democracy can be and how important it is to fight against extremism and intolerance. We need to learn from history so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. If you found this deep dive helpful, be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'll be back soon with another exploration of history, helping you understand the world a little bit better.